If someone had told me a year ago that my marriage would end in betrayal, I would have laughed. Our love was the kind people envied, or so I thought. We weren't flashy or perfect, but we were real. 8 years of shared memories, arguments that always ended with apologies, and dreams of a future filled with adventure. It felt solid, unshakable. The truth is, you never see the cracks until they start to splinter. Life had been busy for both of us. Work consumed our days, and the weekends vanished into a whirlwind of errands, dinner plans, and half-finished home renovations. We were building a future, or at least I thought we were. My wife, Lauren, had a career that demanded long hours and frequent business trips. She loved her work, and I loved that about her. She was driven, focused, and unstoppable. But in hindsight, I see how easily that devotion to her career blurred into something else. The day I discovered the affair started like any other, a blur of routine. I had the day off, so I decided to tackle the growing list of chores around the house. Lauren left early, juggling her laptop bag and travel mug, while she muttered about the hectic day ahead. In her rush, she forgot her second phone, a work phone she rarely used outside the office. By the time I noticed it on the kitchen counter, she was already gone. I figured she'd realize it was missing later, but it didn't seem urgent. She always had her personal phone with her, so this one stayed behind, unnoticed and untouched, until it buzzed mid-afternoon while I was cleaning the kitchen. The screen lit up with a notification, the preview stark and undeniable. Last night was unforgettable. Can't wait to see you again. My breath caught, and my hand hovered over the counter as I stared at the words. The sender's name, Chris, was unfamiliar, and my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was a coworker joking around. Maybe it was spam, but my gut twisted in a way that told me otherwise. I picked up the phone, hesitating for a moment before swiping it open. The threads of text unraveled before me, unraveling something in me as well. There were exchanges of laughter and tenderness that didn't belong to me. Comments like, "Wish I could stay in your arms forever," and "Can't stop thinking about how perfect you looked last night" painted a picture I didn't want to see. There were no photos to confirm the intimacy, no grand declarations, but the quiet familiarity in their words was worse. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. A life they were sharing in stolen moments, one I had no part in. The text read like confessions from a parallel life, a relationship thriving in the shadows. Plans for secret dinners and carefully chosen meeting spots told a story of meticulous effort, of a betrayal woven in layers so complex I couldn't believe I'd missed it. And then, the final text. "One day, we'll have the time we deserve." The room seemed to tilt as I set the phone down, my chest hollow and heavy at once. I felt like an outsider in my own life, standing in the wreckage of a love I thought was indestructible. The hours after my discovery crawled by in agonizing slow motion. My thoughts were a whirlwind of anger, heartbreak, and confusion. I kept trying to fit the pieces together, replaying moments from the last few months in my head like a cruel movie. The late nights at work, the sudden out-of-town meetings, the time she'd seemed distracted even when we were together. It all added up now. How had I missed it? Or maybe I hadn't wanted to see it. By the time Lauren came home that evening, I felt like a tightly coiled spring, ready to snap. I had spent the entire day convincing myself to stay calm, to not confront her until I had processed everything. But the moment she walked through the door, smiling and calling out my name, the betrayal hit me all over again. I stayed in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter as she moved around the house. Her voice carried from the living room as she asked about dinner plans, like everything was normal. I couldn't bring myself to answer. The sound of her voice grated on me in a way I couldn't explain. So familiar, yet suddenly alien. She walked into the kitchen, still talking, and froze when she saw me. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, her tone shifting to concern. "You look off." I forced a smile, though it felt like my face might crack under the strain. "Just a long day," I muttered, not trusting myself to say more. Lauren nodded, seeming to accept my answer, and moved to pour herself a glass of wine. As she turned her back to me, I found myself staring at her, at the ease with which she carried herself, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. Part of me wanted to demand answers right then and there, to shove the phone in her face and watch her scramble for an explanation. But another part of me knew that once the words left my mouth, there would be no going back. Instead, I let her carry on with her evening. She talked about work, about an annoying client, and about a new restaurant she thought we should try for date night. Each word felt like a knife, twisting the wound she didn't even know she had inflicted. I nodded and grunted in response, my mind elsewhere. That night, lying in bed beside her, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, listening to her breathe, and wondered how long she had been doing this, living this double life while I remained blissfully ignorant. I thought about the messages, the familiarity in their tone, and the unmistakable intimacy they shared. This wasn't just some fleeting affair. It was something deeper, something that had been growing in the shadows while I clung to the illusion of our marriage. Morning came too soon, and with it, the realization that I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't let another day go by, smiling and playing along while she continued to lie to my face. I needed to confront her, to hear the truth from her own lips, even if it shattered me completely. As she got ready for work, I stayed seated at the kitchen table, watching her bustle around the house. She hummed under her breath, a tune she often sang when she was in a good mood. It made my stomach churn. "Lauren," I said, my voice cutting through the morning stillness. She paused, turning to look at me. "What's up?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. Part of me wanted to blurt it all out, to tell her I knew, to demand answers, to let the anger I'd been holding back finally erupt. But another part of me, the part that still loved her despite everything, couldn't bring itself to strike the first blow. "Can we talk later?" I asked instead, my voice quieter than I intended. After work, her brow furrowed slightly, and she tilted her head. "Is everything okay?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just something I need to get off my chest. Nothing urgent." She gave me a wary look but eventually shrugged it off. "Okay, we'll talk tonight." She grabbed her bag and leaned down to kiss me on the cheek. The gesture, once comforting, now felt hollow. As the door closed behind her, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Tonight, everything would change tonight. And no matter what she said, no matter what excuses she tried to give, I knew one thing for certain. The life we had built together was already over. It was just a matter of facing it head-on. The hours between Lauren leaving for work and her coming home felt like an eternity. I kept replaying what I wanted to say, imagining all the ways she might respond. Would she deny it? Cry and beg for forgiveness? Or worse, would she shrug it off, indifferent to the wreckage she'd left behind? By the time I heard the sound of her car in the driveway, my hands were trembling. I sat on the couch, phone in hand, the damning messages from Chris still open. My heart pounded as I heard the door unlock and Lauren's familiar footsteps approach. "Hey," she called out cheerfully, setting her bag down by the door. "What did you want to talk about?" I stayed seated on the couch, gripping her phone. "Come sit," I said, my voice flat. She hesitated, her eyes flicking toward me, then slowly walked over and perched on the armchair across from me. "What's going on?" she asked, sounding wary now. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The weight of what I was about to do, what I was about to say, felt suffocating. Finally, I took a deep breath and held up her phone. "You forgot this yesterday," I said, my tone cold. Her eyes widened slightly, and a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Oh, I thought I'd lost it at the office. Thanks for finding it." I didn't respond to that. Instead, I turned the screen toward her. "I found this too." I turned the screen toward her, displaying the message thread with Chris. Her eyes locked on the screen, and for a moment, she froze. Her face drained of color as she stared at the messages. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. "Care to explain?" I asked. "Where did you? How did you?" she stammered, before catching herself. "It's not what it looks like." It was a jumbled mess of half-formed excuses. How it wasn't what it looked like, how I didn't understand. I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Don't insult me, Lauren. I've read everything. Months of texts, plans, little love notes. Don't sit there and tell me it's not what it looks like." She froze, her hands clenching the edge of the chair. It's complicated." "Complicated?" My voice rose, the anger I'd been holding back finally spilling over. "What's so complicated about sneaking around behind my back? About lying to me, to my face, every single day?" The tears started then, and she shifted into explanations. How it had started small, how it wasn't meant to become anything serious. But all I could hear was her saying she didn't feel seen, that I'd been too caught up in work and distractions. You're blaming me? I asked, stunned. She shook her head, but her excuses painted the same picture. I hadn't been enough, so she'd turned to someone else. I wanted to yell, to argue, but I couldn't. What was the point? Her silence, her tears, her excuses. It all told me what I needed to know. Whatever had been between us was broke. I couldn't sit still. My emotions were a storm, and pacing the room was the only way to keep myself from shouting. Finally, I asked the question that had been eating at me. Do you love him? My back was to her, and I didn't turn around, afraid of what her answer might do to me. The silence stretched on, unbearable. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I don't know. That broke me. I turned to face her, the fury and heartbreak boiling over. Then what are we even doing here? If you don't know how you feel about him, or us, what's the point? She cried harder, burying her face in her hands, but I couldn't find it in myself to care. Whatever tenderness I'd once felt had been crushed under the weight of her betrayal. I knew there was no coming back from this. Pack a bag, I said, my voice cold and detached. You're staying somewhere else tonight. I can't look at you right now. She looked up, startled and desperate. Please don't do this. We can fix this. No, Lauren. I cut her off, my tone sharper now. You did this, and there's nothing left to fix. She didn't move from the chair, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I stayed standing, pacing the room like a caged animal, trying to make sense of the chaos she'd unleashed in my life. She stood slowly, almost cautiously, as though I might lash out. I was scared, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Scared of losing us. Scared you wouldn't understand. I laughed bitterly, the sound sharp in the tense room. Understand what? That you were lonely? That you needed more from me? I would have listened, Lauren. I would have done anything for us. But you didn't even give me the chance. Tears streamed down her face, but they didn't move me. She reached out, her hand trembling as if to touch me, but I stepped back. The gesture felt like an insult. You could have talked to me, I said, my voice breaking. She tried to explain, saying it wasn't planned, that it just happened. Stop saying that, I shot back. Affairs don't just happen. You made a choice. You chose him. Her shoulders slumped, and she sank back into the chair, her face buried in her hands. I'm sorry, she choked out. I'm so sorry. The apology only deepened the ache. Sorry doesn't fix this, I said quietly. It doesn't erase the lies, the betrayal. It doesn't give me back the life I thought we had. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Her sobs were the only sound in the room. I turned away, staring out the window. My reflection in the glass looked hollow. Her answer came after a long hesitation, thick with emotion. He made me feel seen, like I mattered. Her words hit me like a punch. I turned to face her, my anger barely contained. After everything I've done for us, you didn't feel like you mattered to me? It's not that simple, she said, shaking her head. I know you love me, but it felt like we were drifting apart, and I didn't know how to stop it. I ran a hand through my hair and let out a bitter laugh. So, instead of fighting for us, you turned to someone else? That was your solution? She broke down then, saying she hated what she'd done, hated herself for hurting me. For a moment, I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with, but the memory of those messages and the life she'd shared with someone else crushed any lingering softness I had. I can't do this, I said finally, my voice shaking. I can't keep looking at you, knowing what you've done. She begged me, saying we could work through it, counseling, anything. But I stepped back, shaking my head. You gave up on us the moment you let him into your life. You don't get to ask me to fight for something you've already destroyed. Her sobs grew louder as she sank to the floor, pleading, but I couldn't comfort her. The anger, the pain, it was too much. Pack a bag, I said, my voice cold and final. You're staying somewhere else tonight. She looked up, her eyes wide with desperation. Where am I supposed to go? I don't care, I said, turning away. Just not here. The night Lauren left, I barely slept. I tried to convince myself that I had done the right thing. The house felt like a graveyard of memories. Every corner, every piece of furniture, a reminder of the life we had built together and the betrayal that had destroyed it. I forced myself to get up the next morning and stick to a routine. Work became my refuge, the one place where I could lose myself in deadlines and meetings, pretending for a few hours that my life wasn't falling apart. But when the workday ended, the emptiness returned. By the third day, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to talk to someone, to let out the storm of emotions swirling inside me. That's when I called my brother, Eric. Eric had always been my rock, older by 3 years. He was the kind of person who could see through the chaos and find a way forward. When I told him everything, his voice on the other end of the line was steady and calm. "Come over," he said. "You shouldn't be alone right now." I drove to his house that evening, the familiar streets offering a small sense of comfort. Eric greeted me at the door with a tight hug, something rare for him, and led me into the kitchen. His wife, Claire, was there too, pouring tea. She gave me a sympathetic smile, but didn't pry, instead excusing herself to give us some space. We sat at the table, a warm mug of tea in my hands as I tried to find the words. "It's like the person I'm married isn't real," I said finally, my voice shaky. Eric leaned forward, his expression serious. "What she did was unforgivable," he said, his tone firm. That conversation gave me a flicker of hope, a reminder that I wasn't completely adrift. We talked late into the night. Eric didn't have all the answers, but just having him listen lightened the weight on my chest. The next few days passed in a blur. I kept my head down, going to work, and trying to piece together some semblance of normalcy. I told myself that with time, things would get better, that I could rebuild. But on the 6th day, the phone call came. I was sitting at the kitchen table when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and saw her name. My stomach twisted. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Lauren," I said flatly. There was no warmth in her voice when she responded. "I just wanted to give you a heads up," she said, her tone clipped. "I've spoken to an attorney." Her words were like a slap. "An attorney?" I repeated. "For what?" "For what I'm entitled to," she replied matter-of-factly. She rattled off a list: the house, savings, other assets. "We both know I'm not walking away empty-handed." My hand tightened around the phone. "Most of that is mine. I earned it. You know that." "I'm not saying you didn't work hard," she replied, her tone almost condescending. "But I was part of this marriage too. I supported you, helped build the life we had. That entitles me to my share." My anger surged. "You cheated on me," I said, my voice rising. "You don't get to act like you're the victim here." "I'm not playing the victim," she snapped. "I'm being practical. The courts won't care about who cheated, and you know that. I have just as much right to this as you do." Her words were like daggers, each one driving deeper into the wound she had already inflicted. "You're unbelievable," I said through gritted teeth. "You destroy our marriage, and now you're trying to take everything I've worked for?" "I don't want this to get ugly," she said, her voice icy. "But I'll do what I have to." Before I could respond, she hung up. I sat there staring at the screen, my chest tight and my mind racing. This wasn't just about a failed marriage anymore. This was about my home, my future, everything I had built with my own hands. Lauren wasn't just leaving me. She was trying to take it all with her. I called Eric immediately. When I told him about the call, his response was swift. "Okay, listen," he said, his voice firm. "You're not dealing with the woman you loved anymore. You're dealing with someone who's looking out for herself. You need to do the same." "What do I do?" I asked. Eric's advice was clear and straightforward. He told me to call a lawyer immediately and to avoid engaging with Lauren unless it was through legal channels. Then, in his typical reassuring way, he reminded me that I wasn't alone in this, that whatever happened, he'd be there for me. Those words, simple as they were, anchored me in a way nothing else had since this nightmare began. The call with Lauren had left me shaken, but Eric's words stayed with me. I wasn't dealing with the woman I once loved anymore. I was facing someone who would do whatever it took to secure what she wanted. That realization hardened me. The next morning, I contacted my lawyer, Sandra, and laid everything out. The details of our marriage, my financial contributions, and even the evidence of Lauren's affair. Sandra laid out the situation clearly. Lauren would likely try to claim joint ownership of the house and other assets. But Sandra explained that if we could show most of the property had been acquired through my income, we'd have a strong case. Savings would depend on whether I could prove they predated our marriage or were exclusively from my earnings. Her advice was firm. Keep things professional. Let her lawyer handle communication, and avoid engaging with Lauren directly. A week later, I came home from work to find an unfamiliar car in my driveway. My chest tightened as I stepped out of my truck, instantly recognizing Chris from the photos on Lauren's phone. He was standing on the porch beside her, his smug expression igniting a fury I struggled to contain. Lauren announced she wanted to discuss property division, accusing me of avoiding her calls. Her calm, clipped tone made it clear she wasn't here for an amicable conversation. Bringing Chris along, she said, was for support. The sight of him there, on my porch, was almost too much. I demanded to know what he was doing here, but he had the audacity to speak up, claiming I needed to be more cooperative. The nerve of it, this man, who had been sneaking around with my wife, standing there and telling me how to behave. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. They kept pushing, Lauren talking about fairness, Chris taking jabs about how maybe she wouldn't have strayed if I'd paid more attention to her. My blood boiled, but I knew better than to give them the reaction they were baiting. Before things could escalate further, another car pulled into the driveway. Eric stepped out, his expression dark as he strode up to the porch. He immediately put himself between me and them, his presence alone enough to shift the power dynamic. Eric didn't hold back. He told Lauren that she didn't get to play the victim after everything she'd done and made it clear that she had no business showing up at my house uninvited. "You walked away from this house when you walked away from my brother," he said, his voice calm but firm. Lauren faltered, her confidence shaken under Eric's glare. Even Chris, who had been smug just moments earlier, seemed unsure of himself now. I took the opportunity to lay down my boundaries, telling Lauren that if she wanted to fight for what she thought she was entitled to, she could do it through her lawyer. I warned them both. If they showed up again, I wouldn't hesitate to involve the police. Lauren muttered in agreement, her face flushed with frustration, and turned to leave. Chris followed close behind, his earlier bravado nowhere to be seen. I watched them drive off, the tension in my chest easing as their car disappeared down the street. Eric clapped a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You handled that well," he said. "But if they pull something like this again, call me first." The first real indication that Lauren intended to fight came when Sandra, my lawyer, received a detailed counterclaim from her attorney. It wasn't the vague plea for fairness I had anticipated. Instead, it was a calculated argument asserting that Lauren's emotional and indirect contributions to the marriage entitled her to a substantial share of the assets. Her lawyer claimed that Lauren's support had allowed me to focus on my career, leading to the property and savings in dispute. They pointed to her lower income, but emphasized her financial contributions to groceries, household expenses, and decor. There was even a claim that she had encouraged me to take a promotion early in our marriage, significantly increasing my earnings. "They're crafting a strong narrative," Sandra said during our next meeting. Her tone was calm, but her words carried weight. She explained that while some of Lauren's claims were exaggerated, they were designed to sound convincing to a judge. Sandra laid out our strategy. We would focus on my direct financial contributions while challenging their claims about Lauren's role in my success. The affair would also be introduced, not as a decisive factor in asset division, but as a reflection of Lauren's lack of commitment to the marriage. In the weeks leading up to the trial, I worked tirelessly with Sandra to compile evidence, bank statements, receipts, emails, anything that documented the financial reality of our marriage. Meanwhile, Lauren and her attorney doubled down, submitting character statements that painted her as a devoted, self-sacrificing wife. What angered me most was their audacity in claiming that Chris had no bearing on the case, insisting their relationship began only after our marriage had broken down. When the trial began, the courtroom became a battlefield. Lauren's lawyer, polished and persuasive, painted her as the emotional backbone of our marriage. He argued that while her contributions weren't always financial, they were essential to the stability and success we achieved. Lauren testified about how she had sacrificed career opportunities to focus on the marriage, claiming she'd even turned down a managerial position for the sake of flexibility. Sandra pushed back during cross-examination, asking pointed questions about these alleged sacrifices. When pressed for documentation, Lauren admitted there wasn't any, Everything, she claimed, had been based on mutual understanding. Sandra then shifted the focus to the affair, highlighting how it undermined Lauren's credibility. Although her lawyer objected, the judge allowed Sandra to question Lauren about her relationship with Chris. Lauren framed it as a source of emotional support during a time when, she claimed, the marriage was already over. Chris took the stand as well, portraying himself as a confidant rather than a cause of the breakdown. He insisted their relationship had only deepened after our marriage had irreparably failed, painting himself as someone who simply stepped in to support Lauren. It was infuriating. While Sandra did her best to expose inconsistencies in their story, it was clear that their narrative, however false, was difficult to discredit outright. They painted me as distant, overly focused on work, and neglectful of Lauren's emotional needs. When it was our turn, Sandra presented the mountain of financial records we'd prepared. Pay stubs, tax returns, and receipts told a clear story. I had been the primary breadwinner, and the assets in question existed because of my hard work. Sandra also challenged Lauren's timeline of the affair, pointing out that she never pursued a separation or filed for divorce before starting the relationship with Chris. Eric testified on my behalf, describing the sacrifices I had made to provide for the marriage. He emphasized the long hours I worked to ensure financial stability, while Lauren spent freely on vacations and luxuries. His testimony helped paint a picture of imbalance, countering Lauren's claims of self-sacrifice. By the time the trial concluded, I was drained. Both sides had presented compelling arguments, and it was clear the judge had much to consider. The weeks after the trial were excruciating. I replayed every moment in my mind, questioning if Sandra and I had done enough to counter Lauren's narrative. The truth had been on my side, but I knew courts operated on perception as much as evidence. When the day of the verdict came, Eric sat beside me in the courtroom, a quiet presence of support. Across the aisle, Lauren sat with Chris just behind her, his smugness barely concealed. She looked calm, even confident. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. She began her decision with an acknowledgement of the case's complexity, outlining the arguments from both sides. As she continued, the judge's ruling became clear. The house and the majority of the savings were ruled as mine, the result of my direct financial contributions. While Lauren's emotional and indirect support had value, it didn't outweigh the tangible evidence we had provided. I exhaled as relief washed over me. The house was safe, and so was most of what I had worked for. Lauren's other claims were denied as well. The judge noted that infidelity wasn't a decisive factor in property division, but made it clear that it had undermined Lauren's credibility. Her involvement with Chris had hurt her case more than her lawyer had likely anticipated. When the judge finished, it was over. Lauren had lost her bid for the house, the savings, and any additional compensation. Outside the courthouse, I felt drained, a strange mix of relief and emptiness settling over me. Eric clapped a hand on my shoulder and said something encouraging, but the words barely registered. As Lauren and Chris walked past us to the parking lot, she didn't look at me. Her expression was hard, bitter, and distant. Chris glared at me, his jaw tight, but I couldn't bring myself to care. The life I thought we were building together had been a lie. Now, it was gone, leaving behind only the pieces of what I'd built on my own. And maybe that was enough.